Listen to me. If you ever want to know what true silence sounds like, the kind that doesn't just rest around you, but the kind that actually crawls inside your ears and starts eating away at your memories, you go lose everything you own. That's where I was. Rock bottom wasn't a metaphor for me. It was a physical address. It was a cold, damp, one-room shack 20 miles past the last mailbox outside of Darby, Montana. My name is Jack, and up until about 18 months ago, I had a life. A real, solid American life. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable. I owned a good house in Spokane, Washington, the kind with a deep front porch and a maple tree that turned brilliant red every October. I had a job running the yard operations at a large regional lumber mill. Good pay, good benefits, and the smell of fresh-cut pine in my clothes that Sarah, my wife, used to complain about but secretly loved. We had 2 kids, Danny and Lily. Danny was 12, all sharp elbows and baseball dreams. Lily was 8, pure sunshine and glitter glue. You see that picture? The one where the man loses his footing? That was me. It wasn't one big disaster. It was a dozen small mistakes that piled up until they looked like a mountain. The recession hit the housing market, and the mill started cutting back. I thought I was smart. I tried to save the operation, took on too much risk, signed off on inventory I shouldn't have. When the bottom finally dropped out, they needed a fall guy, and I was the guy holding the pen. The day I walked out of that office, the air tasted different, like metal and failure. It was the first time in my adult life I didn't have a plan. The house went first, naturally. The bank is patient until they aren't. Then came the marriage. Sarah is a good woman, a truly great woman, but she married a provider, a man who fixed things, not a man who sat on the couch staring at the ceiling, drinking cheap whiskey and watching his life dissolve on the evening news. "I can't watch you do this to yourself, Jack," she said, her voice quiet and tired, not angry. That was the worst part, the tired resignation. She took the kids and moved back to her sister's place in Portland. I didn't fight her. How could I? I had nothing left to offer them but the smell of stale beer and the quiet desperation of a grown man who felt like he was 12 years old again, lost in the woods. So I packed up the few things that were left, some old hunting gear, a couple of heavy wool blankets, and a box of worn-out paperbacks, and I drove east, across the Idaho border into Montana. I landed in the one place I knew nobody would find me, the one place that didn't require me to pay rent, the old hunting shack my grandfather, Pops, had built back in the 50s. Pops called it the retreat. I called it the tomb. It was a rough place, no running water, just a crank pump outside that froze solid by November. Heat came from a potbelly stove that ate firewood like a hungry bear. The air inside always smelled like pine needles and mouse droppings, no matter how much I cleaned. My routine was simple and depressing. Wake up when the light came through the single dusty window. Chop enough wood to survive the next 12 hours. Try to catch a few trout in the creek if the weather allowed. Mostly, though, I just sat. I sat on the edge of the cot, staring at the soot-stained wall, and tried to remember what it felt like to be happy. It's funny, the things you miss when you lose everything. You think you miss the money or the big TV. But no, I missed the noise. I missed the sound of Lily dropping her backpack by the door. I missed the clatter of Sarah making coffee at 5 in the morning. Out here, there was only the wind sighing through the pines and the occasional snap of the fire, and my own breathing, which felt too loud, too heavy. I was wasting away. Not fast, but slowly, surely. I barely shaved. My clothes were threadbare. I'd lost 30 pounds, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones and set up permanent residence. I was just waiting for the Montana winter to finish the job that the economy had started. I'd stopped calling Sarah. I couldn't bear to hear the kids' voices. I figured they were better off thinking of me as a memory, maybe a sad story their mom would tell them when they were older, rather than the pathetic shell I had become. One evening, about mid-January, it was particularly brutal. The wind was howling down off the Bitterroot Mountains like a hungry ghost. The temperature gauge I had tacked outside read 5 degrees Fahrenheit, and I knew that was generous. I'd been sitting by the stove, nursing a cup of instant coffee that was mostly just hot water, feeling the kind of deep, aching loneliness that makes you want to scream, but you can't, because there's no one to hear you anyway. I hadn't seen another human being in 10 days. The small town of Darby felt 1,000,000 miles away. My truck, a beat-up old Ford Ranger, was sitting out front, half buried in a snowdrift, and I didn't even have the energy to shovel it out. I just kept feeding the stove, watching the flames, hypnotized by the tiny bit of warmth they offered. I was thinking about Pops. He was a tough old bird. He loved the solitude. He used to tell me, "Jack, the woods only scare you if you're hiding something from yourself." Well, I wasn't hiding anything anymore. I was out in the open and the woods weren't scary. They were just indifferent. That was worse. I poured the last dribble of whiskey from the bottle I'd been saving for a truly terrible day. Today felt like the winter. I held the glass up to the light filtering through the dirty window. It was already getting dark, the blue hour settling in fast. I took the shot, and the warmth spread quickly through my chest, chasing away the immediate chill, but doing nothing for the deeper, emotional cold. I set the glass down hard on the crude wooden table, and that's when I heard it. It wasn't the wind. The wind was a constant scream up on the ridge. This sound was closer, a crunch, then another crunch, heavy, deliberate, walking on the packed snow right outside the shack. My spine went rigid. Bears were denned up for the winter. Elk usually stayed up higher. It was too heavy for a coyote. I reached slowly for the old 12-gauge shotgun I kept leaning against the wall. It was purely instinct. I hadn't hunted in months. The thought of killing anything felt exhausting. But something was outside, and whatever it was big. I held my breath listening. The sound stopped right at the edge of the porch, which was really just 2 rotting planks of wood leading up to the door. Then came a low, guttural sniff. Not a dog's quick curiosity. This was deep, slow, measuring. It sounded intelligent. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a panicked little drum solo in the silence. I crept towards the window, keeping low, the shotgun heavy and cold in my hands. The glass was so filthy I could barely make out shapes, but the snow outside reflected the faint light of the twilight. I wiped a small circle clear with the cuff of my flannel shirt. What I saw wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. It was a wolf. And I don't mean one of those skinny, shy creatures you sometimes see darting across the road miles away. This was a monster. A huge, magnificent gray wolf, standing easily 3 feet tall at the shoulder. Its coat was thick, matted with snow and ice, a mixture of charcoal gray and stark white around the muzzle. It looked ancient, powerful, and utterly unfazed by the miserable cold. It stood there, right outside my door, its head slightly cocked, and it wasn't looking at the cabin generally. It was looking right through the window, directly at me. I froze. I've lived around wildlife my whole life. I know that usually, if a wild animal sees you, it bolts. They don't linger. They certainly don't stand there holding a steady, unblinking gaze. Its eyes were the color of molten gold, and they weren't aggressive. They were assessing, calculating. And there was something in them that wasn't fear or hunger, but something that looked almost like recognition. The wolf didn't move. I didn't move. The only sound was the distant whine of the wind and the frantic thumping in my own chest. I lowered the shotgun slightly, not because I felt safe, but because pointing it felt like an absurd escalation. What was I going to do? Shoot this magnificent creature just because it was standing on my ruined porch? We held that silent stare for what felt like an hour, maybe only 20 seconds. The wolf's breath plumed out in white clouds in the freezing air. Then, slowly, deliberately, the wolf did something that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. It didn't growl. It didn't bare its teeth. It lifted its massive head and let out a sound that wasn't a howl of the hunt or a call to the pack. It was a single, mournful, deep vibration that seemed to travel right through the wooden walls and settle deep in my stomach. It was the sound of utter, profound loneliness. It sounded exactly like the loneliness I had been carrying inside me for the last year. It was the saddest sound I had ever heard. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the wolf turned its massive body, stepped silently off the porch, and melted back into the deep shadows of the pine. Trees. Gone. I stood there, shivering, long after the sound had faded. I put the shotgun down, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. What in the world was that? I went back to my cot, pulled the thin blanket up to my chin, and tried to rationalize it. Hunger. Just a hungry animal checking out a human scent. They do that sometimes. But I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes. Those golden eyes that held the exact same empty misery I felt looking back at them. I didn't sleep much that night. Every rustle of the wind sounded like heavy paws on the snow. I kept telling myself it was a one-off, a random encounter. But when the weak, gray light finally broke over the Montana peaks the next morning, I knew I was wrong. I forced myself out of bed, shivering as I piled more logs into the stove. The cold was a physical weight. I needed water, which meant I had to go outside to the pump. I pulled on my heavy coat and boots, grabbed the old kettle, and slid the bolt on the door. I hesitated for a moment, then yanked the door open. The wolf was back. It was sitting about 10 feet from the porch, right where the snowdrift met the cleared path. It was curled up, looking for all the world like a massive wild dog waiting for its owner. And right in front of it, placed neatly in the snow, was a perfectly clean, freshly killed snowshoe hare. A gift. My breath hitched. This was beyond normal behavior. This wasn't just an animal. This was a presence. A dark, wild, and intensely focused presence. The wolf lifted its head, looked me dead in the eye, and let out a tiny, soft whiff of air. It was waiting. I had lost everything. My family, my job, my identity. I was ready to give up. And yet, here at the absolute bitter end of my life, a creature of the wild was offering me breakfast. I stood there, the cold wind whipping around me, staring at the gray wolf and the dead rabbit. The hopelessness that had been choking me for months suddenly felt challenged. What did this mean? Was this a threat? A warning? Or something else entirely? I took a shaky step off the porch, feeling the crunch of snow beneath my boot. The wolf didn't flinch. It just watched. I knew, deep down, that this moment was a turning point. I could slam the door, grab the shotgun, and try to scare it off, retreating back into my misery. Or I could step into the strange, cold, impossible reality that had just appeared on my doorstep. I walked toward the rabbit. The wolf's eyes followed every millimeter of my movement. I reached down, my fingers brushing against the still warm fur of the hare. I looked back at the wolf. "Okay," I whispered, the word lost almost immediately in the wind. "Okay, what do you want?" The wolf didn't answer with a sound. It answered with a movement. It stood up, slowly, stretching its powerful body, and then turned its back on me and started walking toward the dense, dark line of trees, pausing only once, looking over its shoulder, making sure I was watching. It wasn't leaving. It was leading. And I had a gut feeling that if I didn't follow, whatever chance I had left at survival or sanity would walk away with it. I looked at the wolf. I looked at the rabbit. I looked back at the wolf. "Okay," I repeated, louder this time, not caring if I sounded crazy talking to a wild animal in the middle of nowhere. "You want me to follow? Fine." But I wasn't going unprepared. Survival instinct, the last shred of my old self, kicked in. I carefully picked up the snowshoe hare. It was heavy, a good solid meal, and it felt like a peace offering. Or maybe a down. Ew, payment. I carried it inside, dropped it on the table, and moved quickly. I grabbed the thickest wool coat I owned, a heavy canvas backpack, and shoved in a thermal flask of hot coffee, or what passed for coffee, a tin of jerky, and my hunting knife. The shotgun stayed, surprisingly. I didn't feel like I was hunting or even defending myself. I felt like I was answering a summons. I slid the bolt back, stepped onto the porch, and scanned the tree line. The wolf was exactly where it had been, waiting patiently. It hadn't moved an inch since I went inside. It watched me gear up with the intensity of a drill sergeant. When I started walking, my boots sinking into the fresh powder, the wolf turned and trotted off, setting a pace that was purposeful but not rushed. It moved with an effortless economy of motion, gliding over obstacles that made me struggle. The first hour was pure agony. My muscles were weak from months of inactivity. My lungs burned in the frigid air. I realized just how deep my self-neglect had gone. I used to be able to hike all day. Now, 15 minutes in, I was sweating under my heavy coat and gasping for breath. The wolf would get about 50 yards ahead, then stop near the trunk of a pine, waiting for me to catch up. It never looked impatient, just expectant. It was like I was failing a simple test, and it knew I had to pass it eventually. We headed generally north, deeper into the Bitterroot National Forest, away from the faint logging road I occasionally used. The silence out here was heavy. It was the kind of cold silence that feels like the world is holding its breath. As I struggled to keep up, stepping over tangled roots and pushing through low-hanging branches heavy with snow, my mind started to churn again. The first real mental activity I'd had since leaving Spokane. "This is insane, Jack," I told myself. "You are following a literal apex predator into the wilderness. It's either going to eat you, or it's going to lead you to its den to feed its pups." But the wolf didn't act hungry. It didn't look back with a predatory gleam. Those golden eyes, when they occasionally locked onto mine, still held that strange, shared sorrow. It was the look of someone who understood rock bottom. I started talking to it, not loud enough for a conversation, just whispering into the wind. "Where are we going, big guy?" The wolf's ears twitched, acknowledging the sound, but it kept moving. "You know, I had a dog once. A golden retriever named Buster. He wasn't quite this demanding." I even managed a small, rusty chuckle, and the sound felt utterly foreign in the deep woods. The terrain started to climb steeply. We were moving onto a ridgeline that was exposed to the worst of the wind. The snow here was wind-scoured and hard, making the footing treacherous. I slipped on a patch of ice, catching myself on a sharp boulder. A spike of pain shot through my knee. I cursed under my breath, leaning against the rock, trying to catch my wind. I thought about quitting, turning around, going back to the shack, and just letting the cold claim me. That had been the plan, right? To give up gracefully. I looked up. The wolf had stopped dead. It wasn't just waiting, it was watching my struggle intently. It took a single step back toward me, its massive head low. And then it let out that same sound from the night before. That deep, sorrowful vibration. Not a howl, but a moan that spoke of immense, ancient grief. It was a challenge and a plea, all wrapped into one. Get up. It was enough. It was the push I needed. I straightened up, grit my teeth against the throbbing knee, and started climbing again. I realized the wolf wasn't just leading me. It was testing me. It was measuring how much fight I had left. After what felt like 3 hours, just when the sun was finally getting high enough to cast sharp blue shadows, the wolf stopped again. This time, it didn't wait near the trail. It walked straight off the path, through a thicket of scrub oak, and stopped at the edge of a small hidden clearing. I pushed through the branches, my face stinging from the cold air. The clearing was dominated by a single object, a giant ponderosa pine, maybe 200 years old, lying on its side. It hadn't been cut. It had been snapped off at the base by a massive recent windstorm, probably the one that had howled through a few weeks prior. This wasn't just a fallen tree. This was a gold mine. The trunk was enormous, easily 3 feet in diameter, and it lay perfectly positioned, slightly elevated off the snow by its own branches, making it easy to access. It was enough dry, seasoned firewood to heat my shack for the rest of the winter, and likely all of next winter too. I had been burning green, damp pine from deadfall near the creek, wood that smoked and burned fast. This was the real stuff. I stood there, staring at the bounty, then looked at the wolf. The wolf didn't look at me. It looked at the tree. Then it looked at the spot where the tree had snapped, revealing the pale, fresh-cut face of the wood. Then, finally, it looked back at me, its expression utterly neutral. The message hit me like a physical blow. Stop wasting time dying. Go to work. It wasn't a spiritual revelation. It wasn't magic. It was practical. The wolf had spotted a massive resource that my self-pity had prevented me from seeking out. It wasn't handing me a fish. It was showing me the best fishing spot. A strange warmth, completely unrelated to the physical exertion, started to spread through my chest. It wasn't happiness, but it was the ghost of purpose. You led me to firewood, I whispered, shaking my head in disbelief. The wolf sat down deliberately in the snow, curled its magnificent tail around its paws, and seemed to settle in. The perfect picture of patience. It was waiting for me to acknowledge the lesson. I pulled off my heavy leather gloves and ran a hand over the rough bark of the fallen giant. The wood felt cold, solid, and real. It was a tangible solution to a very real problem. The problem of freezing to death. I didn't have my axe with me, which was a rookie mistake, but the wolf seemed to understand that. It wasn't expecting me to start chopping now. It was expecting me to start planning. I pulled out my hunting knife and scraped off a small piece of inner bark, confirming the dryness of the wood. It smelled wonderful. Pure, sharp pine scent. A smell I hadn't truly noticed in months, even though I was living in a forest. I spent 20 minutes just charting the best way to section the trunk, marking the snow with my boot heel. The wolf watched the entire time, silent and motionless. It was the most engaged audience I'd had in a year. "All right," I said, zipping up my coat. "Lesson received. I need the axe and the sled, and probably a crowbar." I looked at the wolf. "Thank you, I guess." I expected it to get up and follow me back, but it didn't. It stayed exactly where it was, sitting guard over the woodpile. It simply lowered its head in what looked like a slow, deliberate nod, and closed its eyes slightly against the glare of the snow. It was telling me, "I've shown you the path. Now walk it." The trek back to the shack was faster, despite the pain in my knee. I was exhausted, but the mental fog had lifted. I wasn't just walking. I was moving with intent. I had a task. I had a responsibility, not to the wolf, but to the opportunity it had presented. When I burst through the door of the shack, the air inside felt stale and oppressive, a monument to my failure. I grabbed the axe, the heavy-duty bow, saw, and the old iron sled I used for hauling supplies from the truck path. Then my eyes fell on the rabbit. I'd forgotten about the snowshoe hare. It was sitting right where I'd left it. I realized the wolf hadn't just given me the means for long-term survival, the wood. It had given me immediate sustenance. I couldn't head back out to the woodpile on an empty stomach. That was another lesson my grandfather, Pops, had drilled into me. Never start hard work hungry. I quickly skinned and cleaned the hare. It was messy, physical work, and for the first time in months I didn't feel the need to reach for the whiskey bottle. My hands were busy, my mind focused on the small immediate problem of preparing food. I got the fire roaring, split a few smaller pieces of wood, and skewered the rabbit over the flames. The smell of the roasting meat was intoxicating. It was primal, real, and a 1,000 times better than the canned beans and stale crackers I had been subsisting on. While I ate, tearing the meat off the bone with my hands, I stared out the window at the dense pines. The sun was beginning its slow arc down toward the western peaks. I chewed slowly, savoring every bite. This wasn't just food, it was a victory. A small, strange, improbable victory delivered by a creature that should have been avoiding me. I finished the meal, wiped the grease on my flannel shirt, and felt a surge of energy I hadn't felt in nearly 2 years. I strapped the axe and sawed to the sled. I knew I wouldn't get much done before dark, but I had to start. I had to prove to the wolf and to myself that the effort wasn't wasted. I stepped back out into the cold. The air was already dropping rapidly towards zero. I pulled the sled behind me, following my own fresh tracks back up the ridge line. It was dusk when I finally reached the clearing. The light was fading fast, painting the snow in shades of deep purple and slate gray. The wolf was gone. The only sign that it had ever been there was a slight depression in the snow where it had been sitting, and the massive, silent presence of the fallen Ponderosa. I didn't feel relief, but disappointment. I realized I had been looking forward to seeing those golden eyes again, to getting that strange, silent confirmation that I was doing the right thing. But the lesson was clear. The wolf wasn't going to hold my hand. It had shown me the way. The rest was up to me. I worked until the light was completely gone, relying on the memory of the shape of the trunk. I used the bow saw to cut the first smaller limbs off the main trunk, work that was easy but loud. The sound of the saw cutting through the dry wood was sharp and satisfying, echoing in the twilight. I stacked the limbs neatly on the sled. My body screamed in protest, but I ignored it. This pain was clean, earned. It wasn't the dull ache of despair. I hauled the first load back down the ridge. The sled slipped and slid over the packed snow, trying to pull me downhill, but I fought it every step of the way. When I finally dragged the load onto the porch, collapsing against the door, I looked at my hands. They were blistered, frozen, and smeared with pitch and dirt. They looked like the hands of a working man again. I spent the next hour splitting the newly acquired wood. The dry pine cracked easily under the axe, smelling wonderfully of resin. When I finally stoked the potbelly stove, loading it with the new fuel, the fire roared to life with an intensity I hadn't seen all winter. The heat radiating out was immense, driving the pervasive cold back into the corners of the shack. I sat on my cot, exhausted, watching the flames dance. I had survived today, and not only had I survived, but I had acquired enough resources to survive the next month comfortably. I didn't understand the wolf. I didn't know why it had chosen me, or why it had decided that my miserable, self-destructive life was worth saving. Was it just a coincidence? A territorial animal whose territory happened to contain a windfall? No. The eyes, the hair, the mournful sound. It was too deliberate. I fell asleep that night not to the sound of the wind, but to the comforting, aggressive crackle of the Ponderosa fire. When I woke up, it was still dark, but the shack was warm, truly warm, for the first time since November. I looked outside. Heavy snow was falling, muffling the world. It was a proper Montana blizzard. I knew that if I had tried to go out and scavenge for wood today, I would have failed. I would have likely frozen. The wolf had ensured my survival, giving me a day's head start on the storm. I spent the morning sawing and splitting the rest of the wood I'd hauled down. I ate the remnants of the rabbit, feeling my strength return. I felt capable. But the real test came in the afternoon. The blizzard hadn't let up. Visibility was maybe 20 feet. I was getting cabin fever, but I was also out of fresh water. I had to go to the pump. I bundled up, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the blinding white chaos. And there it was, the wolf. It wasn't sitting neatly this time. It was standing, half buried in the swirling snow, looking like a statue carved from granite and ice. It was guarding the path to the pump. I couldn't believe it. Through a raging blizzard, this animal was still here. I squinted through the falling snow. "What is it?" I shouted, over the wind. "What do you want now?" The wolf didn't move its body, but its head turned slightly, pointing past me toward the back of the shack. I looked back. Just the wall of the shack, buried in snow. The wolf let out a soft, low grunt, a sound of insistence, and then took 2 steps toward the back wall. This time, I didn't hesitate. I trusted it implicitly now. This creature wasn't messing around. I walked around the side of the shack, fighting the wind, following the wolf's tracks, which were already filling with fresh snow. The wolf stopped at the corner of the shack, right by the small rickety woodshed Pops had built 50 years ago. The shed was mostly used for storing old tools and mouse nests now. The wolf lowered its head, sniffing rapidly at the base of the shed wall, then looked up at me with those intense golden eyes. It was frantic now, a subtle tremor running through its massive shoulders. I realized something was wrong. Seriously wrong. It wasn't leading me to resources this time. It was warning me. I dropped to my knees in the snow, scraping away the drifts. The wood of the shed was old, rotting near the ground. I felt around with my frozen fingers, and then I felt it. A draft, a rush of frigid air that wasn't the wind. It was coming from under the shed. I shoved away a loose plank of wood, revealing a dark, gaping hole that had been completely covered by the recent snow. It wasn't a natural hole. It was a tear in the foundation, big enough for something to crawl through. And from the blackness inside, I heard the faintest sound of scratching. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a simple hole. This was an access point, and whatever was inside was trying to get out, or perhaps get in. I looked at the wolf. It was standing guard, its teeth slightly bared, focused entirely on the hole. It wasn't afraid of me. It was afraid of what was in the darkness. The woodshed was attached to the main cabin by a shared wall, a wall that was thin, old, and full of cracks. If something got into the shed, it was only a matter of time before it found its way into the tomb. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering. "What is it?" I whispered. The wolf didn't answer. It just stared into the hole, a deep, silent snarl tightening its muzzle. I knew I needed the 12 gauge. I needed to seal this breach. But first, I needed to know what I was dealing with. A raccoon? A weasel? Too big for that. A bobcat? A mountain lion? I crept back to the front door, grabbed the shotgun, and snatched up the old, bulky flashlight. When I returned, the wolf hadn't moved. It was a perfect sentinel. The scratching from inside the shed was louder now, more urgent. I aimed the flashlight beam into the hole. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating a small, cramped space filled with cobwebs and rotten wood. And then the light found the eyes. Not the golden, assessing eyes of the wolf. These were small, bright, furious green eyes, reflecting the beam back like tiny, angry coals. It was a wolverine. Not a big one, but big enough. Known for their ferocity and impossible strength, a wolverine is the last thing you want trapped in your immediate vicinity, especially one burrowing into your living space during a blizzard. It was cornered, cold, and looking for a warm place to den, and my shack was the target. If that creature had gotten into the shed and found its way through the wall while I was asleep, the story would have ended right there. I looked at the wolf, standing shoulder to shoulder with me in the swirling snow, facing down the threat. The wolf had saved my life. Twice now. Once from despair, and now from a very real, physical danger. It was not just a symbol of the wild. It was a partner, a guide, a silent guardian that had arrived exactly when I had given up. I raised the shotgun, flicked off the safety, and aimed it at the foundation breach. I knew I couldn't shoot the wolverine without risking the integrity of the wall, but I had to scare it out. I chambered around with a loud mechanical clack-shick. The wolf, hearing the sound, looked up at me one last time. In its eyes there was no fear, only a deep, knowing intensity. I took a deep breath, fighting the adrenaline. I was no longer the broken man sitting on a cot. I was Jack, the man who fixed things. "Your move," I muttered to the Wolverine, bracing myself for the fight. This cold, impossible partnership was just getting started. I took a deep breath, fighting the adrenaline. I was no longer the broken man sitting on a cot. I was Jack, the man who fixed things. "Your move," I muttered to the Wolverine, bracing myself for the fight. This cold, impossible partnership was just getting started. The blizzard was a white wall screaming in my ears. The Wolverine's angry green eyes glowed in the flashlight beam, framed by the ragged edge of the broken foundation board. It wasn't retreating. It was gathering itself, a coiled spring of pure malice and muscle. I knew a direct shot was stupid. The Wolverine was small, but it was fast, and the blast would ruin the old shed wall, giving the wind and the snow an open invitation into my cabin. I needed noise, not carnage. I needed to convince it that the easy warmth of my home was not worth the fight. I didn't aim at the hole. I aimed the 12-gauge up, slightly away from the shack wall, toward the base of a thick pine tree about 10 feet away. Boom! The sound in that contained space, amplified by the swirling snow, was monstrous. It wasn't just loud. It was a physical shockwave that hit my chest and made the air taste like gunpowder and fear. The Wolverine didn't wait for the echo. It shrieked, a high, rattling sound that was pure rage, and reversed instantly, disappearing back into the blackness of the shed. Foundation. The wolf, my silent partner, didn't flinch at the noise. Its focus remained locked on the hole. We waited, the three of us, the man, the wolf, and the blizzard, in a tense, frozen silence. Then, about 20 feet away, around the far corner of the shed, I heard a desperate scrabble of claws on wood, followed by a heavy thump in the snow. The Wolverine had clearly found the back exit and decided the howling cold was preferable to the armed lunatic and the giant gray wolf standing guard. The wolf watched the area for another full minute, its ears turning like radar dishes in the wind. Finally, it turned its massive head to me. The golden eyes were calm now, the tension gone from its shoulders. The message was clear. The threat is gone. Now, fix the breach. I put the shotgun down, leaning it against the wall, and went straight to work. I had the bow saw and the axe handy from my firewood hauling, but for this, I needed tools. I needed to seal this foundation properly. I found a couple of thick, seasoned planks in the shed, pieces Pops had clearly stored away for emergencies, and I used the hatchet to cut them to size. Working in the blizzard was brutal. My fingers went numb instantly, but the adrenaline kept the rest of me moving. I hammered the boards tight across the hole, overlapping them, sealing the breach with thick, rusty nails I found in an old coffee can. Every swing of the hammer was solid, purposeful. I wasn't just fixing a wall, I was rebuilding a boundary. I was telling the wilderness and the failure I had imported from Spokane that this space was mine, and it was protected. The whole time, maybe 45 minutes, the wolf stood there. It didn't help. It didn't move. It just watched. It was the supervisor, the silent architect of my recovery. When I drove the final nail home, securing the board so tightly that not even a mouse could squeeze through, I dropped the hammer into the snow and leaned back against the frozen wall, panting. "Done," I gasped, looking at the wolf. The wolf blinked slowly, a perfect, serene acknowledgement of a job well done. Then, without fanfare, it turned and walked back toward the front of the shack, disappearing into the white curtain of the storm. I followed, dragging my feet. When I got back to the door, I saw a familiar sight. The wolf was curled up on the porch, shaking off the snow, settling in for the duration of the storm. It was close enough to be a guard dog, but wild enough to be a force of nature. I crawled back inside, shivering violently, and leaned against the wood stove. I fed it the ponderosa pine, and the heat instantly swelled, chasing the chill from my clothes. I stripped off my wet coat and boots, wrapped myself in a blanket, and just sat there, watching the fire. My hands were scraped, my knee throbbed, and my ears were still ringing from the shotgun blast. But I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Competence. It sounds simple, but when you lose everything, your job, your savings, your family, you lose the fundamental belief that you can do anything. You become useless. For the past year, I was a ghost, waiting for the winter to bury me. Now? I had felled a tree, secured a foundation, and fought off a wolverine in a blizzard, and I owed it all to a silent, golden-eyed wolf. I didn't drink that night. I made instant coffee, the good stuff I'd been saving, and watched the blizzard rage outside. I realized that the wolf wasn't trying to save my soul. It was just providing the necessary stimulus for my practical survival instinct to kick back in. It was giving me problems I could solve with an axe and a hammer, problems that were more immediate and real than the overwhelming systemic failure of my past life. The storm lasted for 3 days. 3 days of being trapped, but for the first time, not feeling trapped. I had enough wood to keep the shack roasting hot. I spent the time splitting, stacking, and organizing. I took the time to sharpen the axe and the knife, running the steel across. The whetstone with slow, deliberate strokes. That rhythmic scraping sound was meditative, cleansing. And the wolf was always there. Sometimes I'd see it through the single dusty window, a massive gray shape curled against the raging elements. Sometimes I'd just feel its presence. It didn't move. It didn't ask for anything. It was just the anchor holding me to the present moment. On the morning of the 4th day, the silence returned. Not the empty silence of despair, but the heavy, muffled silence that follows a massive snowfall. The sky was the brilliant, shocking blue that only Montana knows, and the world outside was pristine, sparkling white. I opened the door and took a deep breath. The air was ice cold but clean. I looked down. The wolf was gone. Just a large, melted depression in the snow on the porch. I felt a flash of disappointment, a small, selfish pang of loss. Had the partnership ended? Had it fulfilled its purpose? But as I looked out into the clearing, I saw a single set of massive paw prints leading away from the shack, heading down the ridge. And then, about 50 yards out, the tracks stopped, replaced by a slight disturbance in the snow under a low-hanging pine branch. The wolf was waiting. It was just giving me space to get ready. I knew what I had to do. The wolverine had forced me to use 2 of my precious shotgun shells. I was down to 10 rounds. My flour supply was critically low, and I needed kerosene for the lamp. My self-imposed isolation had to end, at least temporarily. I had to go to Darby. I spent an hour digging out the old Ford Ranger. The snow was heavy, wet, and exhausting, but I didn't stop until the cab was clear and I could open the doors. The truck, predictably, wouldn't start. The battery was dead, frozen solid by the deep cold. The nearest paved road was 5 miles away, and Darby was another 15 beyond that. 20 miles of walking, round trip, carrying a heavy pack of supplies. The old Jack would have slumped back onto the cot and waited for starvation. The new Jack, the one who had just faced down a wolverine, just laced up his boots. I grabbed the heavy canvas pack. I stuffed in my wallet, still containing the meager $100 I had left, the thermos, a piece of leftover jerky, and the shotgun, just in case. I stepped out onto the path and started walking. I hadn't gone 20 yards before the wolf emerged silently from the trees, taking up a position about 15 feet ahead of me. It wasn't leading the way, it was scouting, setting the pace, a pace that was challenging but sustainable. It was strange. Walking with the wolf felt less lonely than walking alone. It felt like I was part of a unit, A small, weird, two-person, one-wolf survival team. The walk was grueling. The snow on the logging road was deep, and the cold was relentless. But every time my lungs started to burn and I felt the old urge to stop and quit, I looked up at the massive gray figure ahead of me, moving with that effortless, tireless glide. The wolf never looked back to check on me, but it never let the distance between us stretch too far. We walked for nearly 4 hours, the sun climbing higher, reflecting blindingly off the snow. My legs were burning, but my mind was clear. I was focused on the task, one foot in front of the other. As we neared the main highway, Highway 93, the artery that connected me to the world I had abandoned, the wolf slowed. It stopped at the edge of the tree line where the forest gave way to the wide shoulder of the plowed road. The sound of a distant semi-truck gearing down echoed through the pines. The wolf turned its head and looked at me. This time, the look wasn't assessment or sorrow. It was caution. It took one step out of the trees, looked briefly at the highway, then looked back at me, a low, soft whimper vibrating in its throat. This is where I stop. I understood instantly. The wolf was a creature of the deep wild. It could not risk contact with humans, especially not near civilization. It had brought me to the edge of the world I needed to re-engage with, but it wouldn't cross the threshold. I stopped about 10 feet from it. I felt a lump rising in my throat. I hadn't realized how much I had come to rely on its presence. "I get it," I whispered, pulling my glove off to rub my tired eyes. "You've done your part, big guy." "Thanks." I reached into my pack and pulled out the last piece of jerky, a generous chunk of dried venison. I tossed it lightly into the snow near the wolf's paws. The wolf didn't rush. It lowered its head, sniffed the meat, then looked up at me. It didn't touch the jerky until I turned my back. I stepped out onto the shoulder of the highway, the crunch of the salt and gravel under my boots sounding deafeningly loud after the silence of the forest. I started the long walk toward Darby. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew the wolf was watching. Walking into Darby was like stepping onto another planet. People were bundled up, shoveling sidewalks, cars were rumbling, and the smell of exhaust and wood smoke hung heavy in the air. I looked like a refugee. My beard was long and matted, my coat was stained with pitch and rabbit blood, and my eyes, I knew, still held the wild, hollow look of prolonged isolation. People stared. They didn't stare with hostility, but with that vague, pitying curiosity, reserved for the local eccentric or the forgotten homeless man. I didn't care. I walked straight to the general store, the place I used to stock up on cheap whiskey and canned despair. I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The bell above the door jingled, and the warm, comforting smell of coffee, leather, and feed grain hit me. Old Mrs. Peterson was behind the counter, her face wrinkled and kind. She didn't look surprised to see me, just concerned. She had known my grandfather. "Jack, good heavens, child, you look like you wrestled a bear and lost." Her voice was soft, laced with genuine worry. "Hello, Mrs. Peterson. Just a rough few months," I said, my own voice sounding raspy from disuse. "You need to eat something, Jack. You're rail thin." I nodded, avoiding her eye. The old shame tried to creep back in, the shame of being the failure, the man who couldn't hold his life together. But then I remembered the Wolverine, the solid hit of the hammer, the roar of the Ponderosa fire. I wasn't that man anymore, not entirely. "I need supplies, Mrs. Peterson. A big order. Kerosene, 5 pounds of flour, coffee, dried beans, yeast, and a box of 12-gauge shells. The heavy loads." She started pulling the items, placing them on the counter. She didn't ask about the shotgun shells. In Montana, you just didn't ask. As she tallied the total, I looked at the small cooler near the door. It held 6 packs of beer and various bottles of cheap liquor. The old craving, the dull, numbing urge, surfaced. Just a little one. to celebrate the successful trip. I looked at the bottle of cheap rye whiskey. I looked at the box of shotgun shells. I thought about the wolf, waiting patiently in the cold, forcing me to get up and live. I thought about the warmth of the roaring fire, the smell of clean pine. I shook my head. "No liquor today, Mrs. Peterson. Just the food and the fuel." She stopped, looked at me hard, and a small knowing smile cracked her face. "That's good, Jack. That's real good." The total came to $94. I paid her, stuffing the change back into my worn wallet. She insisted on giving me a fresh, hot cup of coffee brewed that morning. It was the best coffee I'd ever tasted. "You take care of yourself, Jack," she said, watching me hoist the heavy pack onto my shoulders. "I will," I promised. And for the first time in a long time, I meant it. The walk back was even harder. The pack was heavy, and the initial burst of adrenaline was gone. Every step was a grind. But I kept moving, repeating the names of my children in my head, Danny, Lily, a rhythm to keep the pace steady. I was doing this for them, too. If I was going to be the man who failed, I was at least going to be the man who survived the failure. I didn't stop until I reached the familiar turnoff, the logging road that led back into the deep, quiet woods. I stood there, panting, adjusting the pack. The sun was starting to dip, casting long blue shadows across the snow. I looked into the tree line where I had left the wolf. Nothing. Just the dark, silent pines. "Okay, I'm back," I called out, my voice hoarse. "Ready when you are." A moment passed, then another. I started to think maybe it was truly gone this time. Maybe the partnership was over and I was on my own again. Then, a rustle. Not in the thick brush, but right where the shadows were deepest. The wolf stepped out, silent as smoke, the jerky long gone. It looked at me, then at the heavy pack on my back. It gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of its massive head, acknowledging the hard-won supplies. Then it turned and started walking up the logging road, setting the same purposeful pace. The partnership was resumed. We were heading home. Over the next few weeks, the routine solidified. The wolf didn't stay on the porch anymore. It established a den somewhere close by, maybe under the massive fallen ponderosa or in a nearby cave. But every morning, when I woke up and stoked the fire, I would find a fresh track in the snow, usually accompanied by a small gift, a trout, a grouse, or sometimes just a feather or a piece of shed deer antler. I took the gifts and I returned the favor. I didn't feed it prepared food, but when I cleaned game, I left the offal and the bones outside, far enough from the shack to respect its wildness. My life changed completely. I was working constantly. I chopped wood. I fixed the leaking roof with tar paper I bought in Darby. I jury-rigged a system to keep the water pump from freezing solid. I was constantly busy, focused on the small, immediate victories of survival. My body hardened. The 30 pounds I'd lost were replaced by muscle. The exhaustion was still there, but it was the clean, satisfying kind that comes from honest labor, not the debilitating fatigue of depression. I even shaved. I looked into the cracked piece of mirror I had tacked up and saw a different man. The eyes were still haunted, but they weren't empty. They held a spark of resilience, a focused intensity I hadn't seen since the mill went under. One afternoon, I was out checking the snares I'd set up around the creek, a skill Pops had taught me decades ago, when I heard it. A different sound this time. Not the sorrowful moan, not the deep snort of acknowledgement. This was a clear, high-pitched yelp of pain. It was coming from the direction of the upper ridge near where the massive ponderosa lay. My blood ran cold. The wolf was in trouble. I dropped the tools I was carrying and ran, scrambling up the steep, icy slope. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think about the danger. This creature had saved my life and forced me back into the world of the living. I wasn't going to let it die alone. I burst into the clearing where the ponderosa lay. The wolf was there, but it wasn't alone. It was snarling, low, and deep, its hackles raised, its massive body tense. Its left rear leg was trapped beneath a section of the huge, split trunk of the ponderosa, a section that had clearly shifted under the recent heavy thaw and refreeze. The timber was too massive for the wolf to move, and it was crushing its leg. Facing the wolf, just beyond the fallen tree, were two coyotes. They were skinny, mean, and opportunistic. They knew the wolf was injured, and they were circling, waiting for their chance to attack. The wolf was ferocious even when pinned, snapping at the air, but the coyotes were relentless. They knew they had the advantage. I didn't think, I reacted. I grabbed a thick, dead branch, heavy and solid, and let out a roar that surprised even myself. It wasn't a warning, it was a pure, primal sound of fury. I charged toward the coyotes, swinging the branch like a club. They were startled by the sudden human intervention. I caught the flank of the nearest coyote with a glancing blow, and it yelped and darted back. The second one hesitated, looking from me to the trapped wolf. I didn't stop. I advanced, shouting every curse word I knew, swinging the branch. I was no longer Jack the failed businessman. I was a protector, fueled by a strange, fierce loyalty. The coyotes decided the risk wasn't worth the meal. They turned tail and sprinted into the dense woods. I didn't pursue them. I dropped the branch and rushed to the wolf. "Easy, easy, big guy," I murmured, kneeling down in the snow, ignoring the deep, rumbling snarl of warning the wolf emitted. The wolf was confused, injured, and ready to fight everything. I could see the distress in those golden eyes, the pain overriding the intelligence. The trunk section wasn't huge, maybe a 4-foot length, but it was thick, dense, ponderosa, weighing hundreds of pounds. I looked at the wolf's leg. It was twisted at an awkward angle beneath the wood. We didn't have much time. The coyotes would be back, maybe with friends, and the cold would set in. I needed leverage. I needed the crowbar I'd bought in Darby, which was back at the shack. "I'm going to get the bar," I told the wolf, my voice low and steady. "I'll be right back. Don't move." The wolf watched me, its breathing shallow and rapid. It didn't fight me when I carefully touched the wood near its head. It seemed to understand. I sprinted back down the ridge. It was the fastest I'd moved since I was 18, playing high school football. My lungs burned, but I didn't care. I burst into the shack, grabbed the heavy iron crowbar, and started back up the hill. When I returned, the wolf was whimpering softly, its head resting on the snow, but its eyes were locked, on the path, waiting for me. "Okay, here we go," I said, sliding the heavy bar under the edge of the log closest to the wolf's body. The log was massive. I strained, pushing down on the bar, using the ground as a fulcrum. Nothing happened. The wood just pressed deeper into the soft earth. I tried again, grunting with the effort. My muscles screamed. I was pushing at the limit of my strength, but the log was immovable. "Come on, Jack, you can do this," I yelled at myself. The old desperation, the feeling of utter powerlessness started to creep back in. The wolf let out a sharp, painful yelp. I stopped, gasping for air, leaning against the bar. I looked at the wolf. Its eyes were fixed on me, not accusing, but pleading. I took a breath and thought like Pops would have. Work smart, not hard. The log wasn't straight, it was angled. If I lifted the center, the weight would just shift. Needed to lift the end closest to the wolf's body, creating a slight gap, then push the wolf out of the trap. I repositioned the bar, driving the point deeper under the far end of the log. I wrapped my hands around the cold, rough iron. I focused every ounce of my physical and mental energy. I thought about the mill, the failure, Sarah, the kids. I channeled all that grief, all that self-hatred into pure, brute force. I heaved. With a terrible, grinding groan of wood against ice, the log shifted. It didn't lift much, maybe 4 inches, but it was enough. "Now!" I screamed at the wolf. I held the immense weight, my arms trembling violently, my knuckles white against the metal. The wolf understood. With a surge of desperate energy, it dragged its massive body forward, pulling its trapped leg free. The moment the leg cleared, I let go of the crowbar. The log crashed back down with a deafening thud. The wolf was free. It lay panting on the snow, shaking, licking its injured leg. It tried to stand, but the leg crumpled beneath it. It was badly sprained, maybe broken. It wouldn't be hunting or even walking far for a while. I sat back on my heels, trembling from the exertion, watching the magnificent creature that had saved me. The wolf lifted its head and looked at me. This time, there was no neutrality. There was no caution. It was pure, unadulterated gratitude. Then, slowly, deliberately, the wolf did something truly astonishing. It pushed itself up onto its 3 good legs, hobbled over to me, and rested its massive head lightly on my shoulder. I froze. A wild wolf, an apex predator, was touching me. I reached up, my hand shaking, and tentatively scratched the thick, coarse fur behind its ears. It was solid, warm, and smelled intensely of pine and wildness. "It's okay, big guy," I whispered, tears suddenly stinging my eyes. "We're even now." The wolf pulled back, gave my hand one quick, rough lick, a gesture of trust and submission I never thought possible, and then began to hobble slowly toward its hidden den. I watched it go, the pain in my own body completely eclipsed by the strange, profound emotion swelling in my chest. I had saved the wolf, and in saving it, I had finally saved myself. I was no longer just surviving. I was living, and I was connected to something real, fierce, and utterly uncompromising. I walked back down the hill, picking up the crowbar. The sun was setting, painting the Bitterroot peaks in fiery oranges and reds. I had flour, kerosene, dry wood, and now a deep, unspoken bond with a creature of the wild. I got back to the shack, stoked the fire, and started making a thick yeast bread. Real food, not just survival rations. As the smell of baking bread filled the shack, warm and comforting, I sat by the window. I pulled out the old photo of Sarah, Danny, and Lily, the one I hadn't looked at in months because it hurt too much. I looked at my children's smiling faces. I looked at Sarah's tired but loving eyes. I realized I couldn't hide in this tomb forever. The wolf had fixed the outside of me. It had forced me to survive. But the inside, the life I ran away from, that was the next foundation I had to fix. I had to call them. I had to tell them I wasn't just alive. I was well. I was working. I was clean. I had to tell them that the man they knew, the man who fixed things, was coming home. I knew the call would be hard. I knew Sarah might not even answer. But I had to try. I owed it to the wolf, and I owed it to the man I had become in the frozen wilderness of Montana. I pulled out the old satellite phone, the one I kept charged for emergencies, which had been silent for 6 months. I powered it on. The screen glowed faintly in the dim light. I dialed Sarah's sister's number in Portland, my finger trembling not from the cold, but from the fear of the future. The connection was slow, sputtering over the remote mountains. It rang once. It rang twice. On the 3rd ring, a voice answered. It wasn't Sarah. It was Lily. "Hello." The voice was small, hesitant, 8 years old, and full of the cautious hope of childhood. My throat seized up. I hadn't heard my daughter's voice in almost a year. "Lily," I whispered, the sound barely audible. "Daddy," she asked, the sound of my name causing a floodgate of emotion to break inside me. "Daddy, is that really you?" I gripped the phone, staring out the window at the dark, silent forest. "It's me, sweetheart," I managed, my voice breaking. "It's Daddy." The silence on the other end was heavy. Then came a small, choked sob. "Where are you? Why didn't you call?" I closed my eyes, feeling the pain of my absence like a physical weight. "I know, sweetie. I made some big mistakes, but I'm better now. I'm fixing things." "Are you coming home?" she asked, the question direct and agonizing. I looked out at the shadows of the pines, imagining the wolf resting and recovering. I had faced down the wilderness, and now I had to face down my past. "I don't know yet, Lilybug," I said, trying to keep the hope in my voice steady. "But I'm working on it. Can you put your mom on the phone for me?" There was a muffled sound, and then Sarah's voice, guarded and weary, came through the line. "Jack?" "Sarah," I said. "Look, I know this is out of the blue. I know you have every right to hang up." "What do you want, Jack?" she asked, her voice flat, emotionless. That was the wall I had built between us. "I want to tell you, I'm clean, I'm working, I'm alive. I'm not the man who left Spokane anymore. I'm fixing the shack. I'm surviving." I paused, searching for the right words, the words that would convey the miracle of the wolf without sounding insane. I found a reason to fight, Sarah. I'm asking for a chance, a small chance. I want to see the kids." The silence stretched for an unbearable amount of time. I could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background of her house, the normal sounds of the life I had thrown away. "You really expect me to believe this, Jack?" she finally said, her voice laced with skepticism and hurt. "You disappear for a year, and now you're suddenly fixed?" "I don't expect you to believe it," I admitted. "I just need you to know it's true. I'm not asking for forgiveness right now. I'm asking if I can write to Danny and Lily, if I can start sending them something, anything, just to show them I'm here, I'm stable." Another long silence. Then a sigh, a sound of immense, tired resignation, but this time maybe a tiny crack of curiosity. "You can write to them, Jack," she finally conceded, "but it comes through me first, and you don't mention anything crazy. You stick to the facts, and you don't promise anything you can't deliver." "Deal," I said, the single word tight with relief. "Thank you, Sarah. I won't let you down." I hung up the phone, my hand still shaking. I had a task. I had a mission. And I had a silent, injured partner resting nearby who needed me to stay put and remain strong. I looked around the small, warm shack. It was still rough, still smelling of pine and wood smoke, but it wasn't a tomb anymore. It was a base camp. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that my journey wasn't over. It was just entering a new, infinitely more difficult phase. I had survived the wilderness. Now I had to survive the reconciliation. But I wouldn't be doing it alone. I had learned the first crucial lesson of the wild. Even the toughest survivors need a pack. And my pack was waiting. I hung up the phone, my hand still shaking. I had a task. I had a mission. And I had a silent, injured partner, resting nearby who needed me to stay put and remain strong. I looked around the small, warm shack. It was still rough, still smelling of pine and wood smoke, but it wasn't a tomb anymore. It was a base camp, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that my journey wasn't over. It was just entering a new, infinitely more difficult phase. I had survived the wilderness. Now I had to survive the reconciliation. But I wouldn't be doing it alone. I had learned the first crucial lesson of the wild. Even the toughest survivors need a pack. And my pack was waiting. The next few weeks became a study in patience and practical loyalty. The wolf, I had started calling him Gray, just in my head, because he needed a name, even if I never spoke it aloud, didn't leave the immediate area. His leg was definitely hurt, but wolves are tough. They don't have the luxury of self-pity. I didn't approach him, and he didn't ask for help, but I made sure he had what he needed. I set up a small covered area near the shed, a little windbreak, and I left fresh water there every morning, melting snow in the stove. And I hunted, not just for myself, but for him. I used the snares, I used the shotgun sparingly, and I brought back grouse and rabbit. I would leave the fresh kills near his den, then retreat. He always waited until I was gone before he took the meal. The boundary remained, but it was a boundary defined by respect, not fear. As the wolf healed, so did the shack, and so did I. I finished the foundation repairs. I installed a new latch on the door. I even spent 2 whole days clearing the window glass until the Montana light streamed in, bright and unfiltered. The shack didn't feel like a retreat from the world anymore. It felt like a home base. And I wrote. I wrote long letters to Danny, and Lily, and shorter, more careful ones to Sarah. I didn't talk about the wolf, or the wolverine, or the despair. I wrote about the work. I wrote about the strength of the ponderosa pine, the clarity of the creek water, and the quiet satisfaction of heating a small room against a massive cold. I wrote about Pops, remembering the good stories, not the sad ones. I told Danny how I was sharpening the axe, teaching him a skill I hoped to teach him, in person someday. I told Lily about the colors of the sunset over the snow, trying to capture the beauty I was finally noticing again. Sarah's first response came a week later, tucked into an envelope with a short note. They like the letters. Keep it up. It wasn't a lot, but it was a lifeline. It was a crack in the wall. Then came the letters from the kids. Danny, all teenage sharpness, asked practical questions about the axe and the snow. Depth. Lily, sweet and direct, drew me a picture of a stick-figure man standing next to a very large, gray, smiling dog. She called the drawing Daddy's New Friend. I hung it on the wall next to the stove, and it made me smile every time I saw it. As the calendar flipped toward March, the deep freeze finally broke. The snow started to turn slushy, and the air smelled like wet earth and the promise of spring. Gray's leg was clearly better. I saw him testing it, running short, powerful bursts through the clearing, still favoring it slightly but clearly gaining confidence. I knew the end of our partnership was near. He was a creature of movement, of the hunt, and the spring thaw was his call to return to the mountains and the pack he truly belonged to. One morning, the sun was bright and warm enough that I was working outside in just a heavy flannel shirt, splitting the remaining logs. It was good, rhythmic work, the axe head singing against the dry wood. I paused to wipe the sweat from my brow, and I saw him. Gray was standing on the ridgeline, silhouetted against the bright blue sky. He was standing perfectly balanced on all 4 legs, his tail held level, his posture magnificent. He looked entirely healed, entirely whole. He wasn't looking at me with assessment or expectation. He was looking with quiet regard. I leaned the axe, bore it against the chopping block. I knew this was it. "You're ready," I called out, my voice rough. "Good. Go get him, big guy." I walked over to the chopping block and picked up a piece of the freshly split ponderosa, a perfect wedge-shaped chunk of dry, fragrant wood. I walked to the edge of the clearing, and I placed the wood carefully on a flat, snow-free rock. A final offering, a symbol of the life he had forced me to build. I walked backward, slowly, giving him space. Gray watched the wood. Then he looked at me one last time. It was a long look, those golden eyes burning with an intensity that felt like a lifetime of understanding packed into one moment. Then, without a sound, he turned and stepped off the ridge, melting into the dense pines. He didn't look back. He was gone. The silence he left behind wasn't the empty silence of despair. It was the full, heavy silence of the wilderness, a silence that now felt like a promise instead of a threat. I was alone, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't lonely. I went back to work, swinging the axe harder, cleaner. A week later, I got a registered letter from Portland. It wasn't Sarah's sister's address, it was Sarah's own handwriting on the return label. I ripped it open, my heart hammering like it had when Gray first appeared on the porch. It was short, just a single piece of lined paper. Jack. The kids are asking too many questions. Lily is drawing wolves everywhere. Danny wants to know if you can teach him how to sharpen his pocket knife. I need to see it. I need to see you. I need to see the base camp you keep talking about. We are driving up for spring break. We'll be in Darby on April 15th. I'll call the general store when we arrive. Don't mess this up. Yes. April the 15th. That was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to prepare for the ultimate inspection. I didn't panic. The old Jack would have spiraled into whiskey and self-doubt. The new Jack immediately grabbed a pencil and started making a list. I needed to fix the hinges on the door, scrub the soot off the stove, repair the hole in the outside bench, and, most importantly, clear the 5 miles of logging road of debris and winter damage so Sarah's small SUV could make it to the shack. I worked like a man possessed. I used the crowbar and the axe, dragging fallen limbs off the road, smoothing out the worst ruts. I wasn't just fixing the road, I was paving the way back to my family. When April 15th arrived, the shack was spotless. The air smelled of fresh pine and clean laundry. I had even driven the Ranger, finally fixed with a new battery I bought in Darby, into town to use the laundromat. The woodpile was stacked high, neat and dry. The whole place hummed with the quiet competence of a man who had found his footing. The call came through Mrs. Peterson at 3:00 p.m. "Jack, Sarah's here. Says she's got 2 small passengers and a lot of luggage, and she sounds tired." "We're ready, Mrs. Peterson. Tell her to take the old logging road about 5 miles past the creek crossing. The road is clear." I walked back to the shack, heart pounding, and waited. The sound of... The engine was faint at first, then grew louder, closer. Finally, a dusty, small SUV pulled into the clearing. The moment the car stopped, the doors flew open. Danny, taller, leaner, and all sharp elbows, tumbled out first, followed by Lily, whose blonde hair seemed even brighter than I remembered. "Daddy!" Lily screamed, abandoning the luggage, running straight across the clearing toward me. I dropped to my knees in the dirt, catching her in a fierce, bone-jarring hug. She smelled like sunshine and city air, and the weight of her small body was the most real thing I had felt in 2 years. "Oh, Lily Bug, look at you," I managed, my voice thick with emotion. Danny, ever the cautious teenager, stood back, watching, but his eyes were wide with curiosity, taking in the shack, the woodpile, the clean, capable man standing there. Then Sarah emerged. She looked older, tired, but beautiful. Her expression was guarded, assessing. She didn't rush. She stood by the car, letting the kids have their moment, but her eyes were scanning everything. The fixed foundation, the stacked wood, the clean windows. She was looking for the ghost of the failure she had left behind. I stood up, letting Lily cling to my leg. "Hello, Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Jack," she replied, a single, neutral acknowledgement. "It looks different." "I fixed things," I said simply. "Come inside. The fire's warm." The kids rushed in first, Danny immediately gravitating toward the heavy bow saw leaning against the wall, Lily looking for a place to put her glitter glue. Sarah stepped inside, her eyes taking in the small, clean space. She saw the stack of books, the sharpened tools, the heat radiating from the ponderosa pine. She saw Lily's drawing of the smiling gray wolf tacked to the wall. She turned to me, her eyes finally softening, losing some of the protective hardness. "You look," she started, searching for the word. "Like a lumberjack who hasn't been drunk in 5 months," I offered, managing a small, real smile. She nodded slowly. "Like a man who's been working. Where's the whiskey, Jack?" I walked to the corner where the old liquor cabinet used to sit. Now, it was just a shelf with a neat stack of thermal blankets. "It's gone." I poured it out the day after I realized I had something worth fighting for. She looked at the drawing of the wolf. "Lily drew this. She said her daddy's new friend helped him." I looked at the drawing, then back at Sarah. "He did. He taught me that despair is a luxury the wild doesn't allow. He gave me a problem I could solve, and then he gave me the resources. And he gave me a reason to fight the wolverine that tried to move in. I told her the story then. Not the spiritual, mystical version, but the clean, practical version. The starving, injured wolf who brought me a rabbit, led me to firewood, and stood guard while I fixed the foundation. I told her how I had to save him to save myself. She listened without interruption, her expression moving from skepticism to awe. "A wolf," she repeated quietly. "He was your anchor." "He was my pack," I corrected. "He was the temporary pack that forced me to realize I needed to rejoin my real one." That night, we didn't talk about the divorce, or the money, or the failure. We made a huge pot of chili and sat by the fire telling stories about Pops and the old days. Danny asked me 100 questions about the woods, and Lily sat on my lap, falling asleep to the sound of the Ponderosa fire crackling. Sarah and I slept on the cot, under the heavy wool blankets, the fire keeping the small room roaring warm. We talked in whispers until the early morning hours, not about marriage, but about the future. "This is not a life for the kids, Jack," she said, her voice quiet. "This shack is wonderful, and you're better, but our life is in Portland now. Their school, my job." "I know," I agreed. I'd already realized that. My task wasn't to hide in Montana. It was to bring the resilience I learned here back to the world. "I'm not asking you to move back here. I'm asking for a chance to start over near you. A fresh start. I've got skills, Sarah. Real skills now. I can build anything." She turned, looking at me in the dim light. "What do you plan to do?" "I'm going to sell the shack," I said, the words surprising even myself. "Pops left it to me. I'll take the money, pay off some debts, and buy a small piece of land near you. Maybe start a small custom woodworking shop. I can build the best cabinets in Portland, Sarah. I just need a chance to prove I'm reliable again." She didn't answer right away. She just reached out and touched the calloused, thick skin of my hand, the hand that had held the axe, the hammer, and the crowbar. "You can come back, Jack," she finally whispered, "but you have to promise me you bring the man I see here with you, the man who fights for his survival." "He's not going anywhere," I promised. "He's part of the wood now." We stayed in Montana for the rest of the week. We hiked, we fished, and I showed Danny how to safely handle the axe and how to identify the best dry wood. I was their father again, capable and present. On the last morning, before they packed up the SUV, Lily ran out to the porch and stopped. "Daddy," she called, pointing down the path. "Look." I walked over. In the wet dirt of the path, right, where the tires of the SUV would soon pass, was a single, perfect paw print. Massive, distinct, and deep. Gray had come by one last time, checking on his pack. Lily looked up at me, her eyes wide with wonder. "He came to say goodbye, didn't he?" I knelt down and put my arm around her. "He did, sweetie. He knows we're leaving, but he knows we're okay." I looked at the print. It wasn't just a sign of the wolf's presence. It was a seal of approval. The partnership was officially dissolved. The lesson was learned. We packed the car. Sarah, Danny, and Lily got in. I stood by the door of the shack waiting. Sarah rolled down the window. "We'll see you soon, Jack. Don't be long." "I won't," I promised. As the SUV pulled away, bumping gently down the logging road, I watched them go until the sound of the engine faded entirely. I turned back to the shack. It was quiet now, truly empty. I looked at the clean windows, the massive wood pile, the sturdy foundation. I was ready to leave. I spent the next 2 months wrapping up my life in Montana. I sold the shack to a retired couple looking for true wilderness solitude, telling them only that the place brought good luck. I bought a cheap, reliable used truck and loaded it with my tools, my memories, and Lily's drawing. I drove west, across the Idaho border, toward the rain and the green of the Pacific Northwest, toward Portland. I didn't have a plan beyond Sarah's tentative acceptance, but I had something better than a plan. I had competence. I had grit. And I had the quiet, unwavering knowledge that if I could survive the cold indifference of the Montana wilderness, I could survive anything the human world threw at me. I pulled into Portland on a sunny Saturday afternoon, parking my truck on the street outside Sarah's sister's house. I didn't knock. I just stood there, breathing the city air, smelling the salt from the ocean and the exhaust fumes, feeling the strange, unfamiliar warmth of the urban hustle. The front door opened and Danny stepped out, holding a baseball bat and wearing a slightly too big Mariners jersey. He saw me, and his eyes lit up. "Dad, you made it." "I made it, son," I said, dropping my duffel bag. Danny didn't ask about the truck or the money. He looked at my hands, rough and ready. "Can you show me how to sharpen my knife now?" he asked, holding out a small, dull blade. I smiled, taking the knife. It was a simple, small task, but it was the start. It was the repair of the small things that led to the repair of the big things. "Yeah, Danny," I said, pulling a whetstone from my pocket, a habit I had picked up from the wolf's long, patient watch. "Let's go to work." I followed my son up, the porch steps, ready to start building my new life, a life forged in the fire of the wild. A life where I finally understood that true strength wasn't measured by what you owned, but by the size and loyalty of the pack you fought for. And I was home.